Good evening, everyone. So it's a very sad fact of human nature that throughout history, xenophobic, intolerant and racist attitudes have always had a significant grip upon humanity. And in today's hyper-connected world, such outlooks have hardly even been defeated. And some of the news articles that we might be familiar with recently, which deal with such topics, we have, don't know if we saw this on the news in just the last couple of weeks, that such prejudices have a modern existence in societies around the world. And these here are, there were some recent reports of 1 million Uyghurs being held against their will in re-education camps across Western China, where they're reportedly being forced to endure severe political and religious indoctrination. We also have the documented plight of the Rohingya. Recently, hundreds of thousands of refugees fled the western provinces of Myanmar in Asia for the neighbouring country of Bangladesh in what the UN described as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. So yes, these attitudes, these xenophobic and racist attitudes, still are very much in existence today, despite the so-called enlightenment of our times. But perhaps the longest existing prejudice against a group of people is that which is defined today as anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism really is defined as hostility toward or discrimination against Jews as a religious, ethnic or racial group. And anti-Semitism today is on the march, from the far-right demonstrations in Charlottesville, Virginia, with their chants of "Jews will not replace us," to attacks on synagogues in Sweden, and arson attacks on kosher restaurants in France, and a spike in hate crimes against Jews in the UK. Anti-Semitism seems, in our times, to have been given a new lease of life. And the seemingly endless conflicts in the Middle East have made the problem worse as they give way to divisive domestic politics in the West. So one thing is clear, anti-Semitism does exist in the world today, and it's getting worse. It rears its head in every aspect of public life, whether internal debates with political parties, as we've seen in our own country, or accusations of conspiratorial networks or plots in politics and business, as the old stereotypes of Jews remain. And there was an article written in the Atlantic magazine, some of us might be familiar with that, the editor called Jeffrey Goldberg, when he says that what we are seeing is an ancient and deeply embedded hostility towards Jews that is re-emerging as the events of World War II recede from our collective memory. He says that for 70 years, in the shadow of the death camps, anti-Semitism was culturally, politically and intellectually unacceptable. But now, he says, we are witnessing an unusual epoch in European life, the age of the post-Holocaust Jewish dispensation. Anti-Semitism has been called history's oldest hatred and has shown itself to be remarkably adaptable. It comes and is sustained by powerful events of history and inherited stereotypes. But it also takes on different forms to reflect the many fears and anxieties of an ever-changing world. And it's no coincidence, perhaps, that with the rise of populism and nationalism in the West again, that anti-Semitism is also on the rise. The word anti-Semitism was popularised by the German journalist Wilhelm Marr, seen on the right here. And he wrote a pamphlet called The Victory of Jewry over Germandom. And Marr was a secular man of the modern world, and he rejected the ancient Christian anti-Semitism, which was allegations long made against the Jews, such as that Jews engaged in the ritual murder of Christian children. Instead, he undertook and held to himself a more fashionable form of anti-Semitism. These were the theories of people such as the French academic Ernest Renan, who viewed history as a world-shaping contest between Jewish Semites and Aryan Indo-Europeans. And Marr writes that the Jewish threat to Germany was racial. He said it was born of their immutable and destructive nature, their tribal peculiarities and alien essence. Anti-Semites like Marr, they really tried to disengage their own modern secular anti-Semitism with some of the superstitions and the bigotry of the past. And it's a tactic which is also employed by some contemporary anti-Semites who align themselves with anti-Zionism, an idea whose definition often generates much controversy. But this continuing hostility towards Jews from ancient times to modern times has been made manifest to many. And the American historian, a chap by the name of Joshua Trachtenberg, who wrote during World War II, he said that modern so-called scientific anti-Semitism is not an invention of Hitler's. It has flourished primarily in Central and Eastern Europe, where medieval ideas and conditions have persisted until this day, and where the medieval conception of the Jew, which underlies the prevailing emotional antipathy towards him, was and still is deeply rooted. In fact, up until the Holocaust, anti-Semitism flourished just as much in Western Europe as it did in Central or Eastern Europe. We can consider, for example, how in France society was really bitterly divided between the years of 1894 and 1906. And we might remember this event from previous lectures. The Jewish army officer, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, was falsely accused and convicted of spying for Germany. And this brought about many divisions in France, conservatives against liberals, and socialists and Catholics against Jews. We have some examples of some of the anti-Semitism that was on display in France during this time. This is a caricature created in 1898 showing the Jew Rothschild with the world in his hands. We know that's a common stereotype about Jews. And in 1889, in Paris, in France, there was an election poster for a self-described candidate anti-Semite. So they're actually putting this on these posters, which we can see up here. Look, candidate anti-Semite in an election poster. Can't quite imagine that today. And the chap who was looking for election was a guy by the name of Adolphe Villette. And some of the translation of this text, I think it's a song actually, it's a song which, or some sort of poem which he's concocted for his election campaign, and some of it can be translated as, "The Jews are a different race, hostile to our own. Judaism, there is the enemy." And you can see that, this section here underneath. Now this chap here, by the name of Sigmund Livingston, was a German-born American Jewish attorney working in Chicago, Illinois. And he was the founder and first president of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. I don't know if many of us are familiar with this institution, but it was founded in 1913, and it was founded when a Jewish warehouse owner was convicted and imprisoned for the rape of a young black girl in one of the warehouses in America in the early 20th century. And that conviction was eventually overturned, but before he could be released from prison, about 20 men plotted to enter the prison, and they took this Jewish warehouse owner outside and hanged him as a lynch mob. And Sigmund Livingston, as an attorney, was greatly affected by the events of this case, and so he formed this institution called the Anti-Defamation League, which was to stop the defamation, as their charter puts it, of the Jewish people, and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. It's actually become America's top civil rights or human relations agency. And you might remember when Starbucks in the news recently had the issues with racism, and when it broke in the news that they'd kicked out a couple of black guys out of one of their cafes, they actually brought in, when they were running their educationary classes for all of their workers in the States, that they brought in the Anti-Defamation League to advise them and to help them come up with this package that they were going to give to their workers, this training. So the ADL today is, as I've said, the top American civil rights agency. And they, one of the areas that they work in is to try and understand levels of anti-Semitism around the world. And in 2014 it published the results of a global survey which set out to define levels of anti-Semitism in a meaningful way. And the authors of the survey selected 11 established Jewish stereotypes and asked respondents all around the world to agree or disagree with the statement that they put forward. And if they marked agree against one of these statements, it would have to be 6 out of the 11 in total for that individual who they interviewed to be regarded as holding or be a person of an anti-Semitic disposition. So if you just answered agree to one of these, then obviously you weren't marked down as such. And these were the results. It was the data here shows as a result of 53,000 interviews among citizens aged 18 and over across 101 countries around the world and the West Bank and Gaza. And the study is known as the ADL Global 100. And we can see here that, some quite shocking figures really. So a quarter of the respondents in Western Europe, when grouped together as a whole, show that there's a quarter of people in Western Europe who hold anti-Semitic views, and this perhaps predictably grows in places like the Middle East and North Africa and in Eastern Europe, but is less in the Americas and Oceania and Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And some of the insights that they took from this survey were some interesting things. Funnily enough, Iran is actually the least anti-Semitic country in the Middle East. The most commonly answered, or the most commonly agreed with Jewish stereotype is that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to the country that they live in. There's also, apparently, if you misestimate the population of Jewish people in the world, you're more likely to be anti-Semitic. Apparently there's 18% of people who responded to this survey think that the total worldwide Jewish population is over 700 million people. It's actually 13 million. But if you think that the population is greatly inflated, then you're more likely to be an anti-Semitic, an anti-Semite, sorry. And also an interesting note here, in the Muslim world, where you get your information from is a good measure for how anti-Semitic you are. So if you get the majority of your news from the internet, then you're more likely to be anti-Semitic, whereas if you speak to people by word of mouth, you're less likely to be anti-Semitic. So you can drill down and find out some interesting conclusions from this survey. Another one that I thought was quite interesting was the views about the Holocaust. So the blue figure in each section or each slice of the world shows people who have heard about the Holocaust, and the red section is the percentage of people who have heard about it but think it's either a myth or has been greatly exaggerated. And again, we can see perhaps in places that we might expect, like the Middle East and North Africa, less than half of people have heard about the Holocaust, apparently, and 63% of people who responded to this survey thought that it was either a myth or was being greatly exaggerated. So we can see here some of the consequences or the reality of anti-Semitism around the world. Another comprehensive data set on worldwide anti-Semitism comes from Tel Aviv University, and it runs this Centre for the Study of Modern European Jewry, and it works out every year or tallies official reports of anti-Semitic violence, death threats and vandalism, and it publishes these in an annual report. And it shows that since 1989, and this survey, this chart ends in 2012, that there has been a clear and consistent rise in anti-Semitic violence. That little spike in the graph on the right-hand side correlates with the 2008 incursion into Gaza by the IDF, and this globally resulted in an increase of attacks against Jews around the world. So this modern analysis of anti-Semitism continues to show that there is a historic documented trend of prejudice and oppression against the Jewish people, which has been ongoing in one form or another, perhaps since the forced labour of the Jewish people, the Hebrews, amongst the pyramids of Egypt. But in the face then of this continued prejudice and persecution, it's astonishing to see that the Jewish people have flourished in the face of such prejudice. The people who came from the ashes of the camps of Europe have retained their proud identity. And over 100 years ago, the prolific writer Mark Twain commented upon the obstinate endurance of the Jewish people, and he wrote this in an essay. He wrote, if the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of. He has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names of literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also away out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvellous fight in this world in all the ages, and he has done it with his arms tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and be excused for it. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendour, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch higher for a time, but it burned out, and they all sit in twilight now or have vanished. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal, but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? The secret that Mark Twain referred to is, to the reader of the Bible, not much of a secret at all. And as we considered last week, when we considered how God's people came to be, we can return to the words of the Scriptures and have a look at Deuteronomy in chapter 7. And this is the reason why the Jewish people continue to endure. We read there in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, Moses telling the people, "You are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession, out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keeps his commandments to 1,000 generations. Yes, this ultimately is why the Jewish people have continued to endure, despite the centuries and the history of their persecution and discrimination and prejudice against. It's because of the connection between the Creator and those people who he chose. Now, this covenant promise between God and his people was fully established at the entrance to the Promised Land, where after a 40-year Exodus journey, the nation arrived at the east of Canaan. And we remember how they were liberated from bondage in Egypt and brought right up to the eastern side of the Promised Land at the River Jordan. And there God made a covenant promise with his people. And we can read about that in Deuteronomy and chapter 28. And it's very similar to, but a bit more full in content to what we've read already in Leviticus in chapter 26. So in Deuteronomy 28, the words of this covenant are spelled out, and then certain blessings are promised the people if they adhere faithfully to this covenant and the commandments which God has set before them. But also in Deuteronomy and chapter 28, in the second part of the chapter, a certain number of curses for disobedience are also laid down. And we've summarised or brought out some of the key sections of this part on the screen now. So we begin there in verse 58. If you do not carefully follow all the words of this law, which are written in this book, in which the nation gladly agreed to, and do not revere this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, and then the chapter really lists out many of the things which would befall the nation if they disobeyed and broke this covenant. And I've highlighted there the section from verse 64, that the Lord will scatter you among all nations, from one end of the earth to the other. There you will worship other gods, gods of wood and stone, which neither you or your ancestors have known. Among those nations you will find no repose, no resting place for the sole of your foot. There the Lord will give you an anxious mind, eyes weary with longing and a despairing heart. You will live in constant suspense, filled with dread both night and day, never sure of your life. In the morning you will say, if only it were evening, and in the evening, if only it were morning, because of the terror that will fill your hearts and the sights that your eyes will see. And we can go through and read chapters such as Leviticus chapter 26 and Deuteronomy chapter 28, and we can match many of the descriptions of the curses which would be brought upon the nation because of their disobedience to some of the events that have taken place in the history of Israel and the history of the Jewish nation as they've been dispersed. But I would submit that it might be somewhat arrogant for a non-Jew such as myself to suggest that persecution against the Jews is as a result of the breaking of the Mosaic covenant. Who am I to link these two things? But long before any of us began to look at this topic, we find also the conclusion of Jews in the scriptures regarding the suffering that they came under. And so we have in chapter 1 of Nehemiah, and Nehemiah was the man who led that first return of the exiles back to the land of promise from their exile under the Persian Empire. And we read there in Nehemiah in chapter 1, Nehemiah commits this prayer to God, and it's really a prayer on behalf of his people. And we read there in verse 5, and I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God, this is from the ESV, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, verse 6, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you, day and night, for the people of Israel your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen, to make my name dwell there. So Nehemiah then, in this prayer to God, linked the captivity of the Jewish people, how they were taken away out of the land under the Babylonians and forced and scattered throughout all the Babylonian Empire, and then that continued under the rule of the Persians. He links this exile to the breaking of the covenant that the nation had made under Moses, those covenants that we've just read about. So Nehemiah here makes the link. We don't have to do this for ourselves. Another prophet, Daniel, in another prayer to God, again on behalf of his people, says much of the same thing in Daniel chapter 9. O Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned and done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and rules. We have not listened to your servants the prophets who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes and our fathers, and to all the people of the land. To you, O Lord, belongs righteousness, but to us open shame, as at this day to the men of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to all Israel, those who are near and those who are far away, in all the lands to which you have driven them, because of the treachery that they have committed against you. Verse 11, all Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, refusing to obey your voice. And the curse and oath that are written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out upon us, because we have sinned against him. Verse 12, he has confirmed his words, which he spoke against us, and against our rulers who ruled us, by bringing upon us a great calamity. So just like Nehemiah, the prophet Daniel also made this link between the breaking of the covenant oath which the people had made with God at the time of Moses and their current predicament in exile, in captivity amongst the nations. So again, we have a biblical precedent for making the connection between the persecution of the Jews and their breaking of the covenant that they made at the time of Moses. Now, such persecution, whilst they were dispersed, is also written of in the Scriptures. And there's a section or a narrative in the Scriptures that speaks about this persecution while they were dispersed. So after the conquest of Jerusalem under the powerful Babylonian Empire, a large amount of Jewish captives were taken in exile to the rest of the empire. And such a practice was deliberately undertaken in order to stop organised resistance against Babylonian rule. And on the left-hand side here is a map that showed the taking of captives really into the heart of the Babylonian Empire. And on the right-hand side is a bas-relief which shows the Jews being driven forward, the Jewish captives being driven forward by the Babylonian conquerors. And many of these exiles came to dwell in Susa. And Susa is one of the oldest cities in the world. Excavations have uncovered evidence of habitation dating back to 4200 BC. And Susa was an important city of the Elamite, Persian and Parthian empires. The Greek name for the city was Susa and the Hebrew Shushan. The Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote extensively on the Achaemenid Empire, reported that Susa was the grand capital of the Persian Empire and the only capital that he knew of. And it's in this city that the book of Esther is set. And in Esther, that book, we are introduced to one of the main characters, Haman. He's the character seen here in the picture on the left-hand side. Haman was a man of considerable authority in the empire after he had won a promotion at the hand of the king of the land, Artaxerxes. To this man, great respect was shown by all the king's servants, and we can see them here depicted in the picture on the left as bowing down the head to Haman as he walked by. However, Haman noticed that one chap did not give him the honour that he thought he deserved, and we can see the man sitting there slightly apart from the others, not bowing his head. And this man was Mordecai, the uncle of Esther, in the picture on the right-hand side depicted. Esther was a beautiful Jewish exile who had just been chosen to replace Vashti as queen to the king. And when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honour, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, the Jews, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai, and instead Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of the Persians. And using his authority in connection with the king, Haman was able to pass a law commanding what we would now term as the genocide of the Jews. And we read that dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to take possession of the riches or the treasures of the Jews. And Haman had selected this day for the slaughter. And wanting to make an example of Mordecai, who he hated, Haman built a special gallows about 75 feet high to hang his enemy on. And of particular note is the reason that Haman gave to justify this plan to the king. And we find it in Esther chapter 3 verse 8. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them." And is this not the classic argument of the xenophobe and one of the principal motivations for the hatred of the Jews? Haman chose to justify his mad plot by emphasising the difference between the practices and customs of the Jews and the other inhabitants of the empire. And in this really foreshadowed the motivations for Jewish persecution throughout the centuries, because the Jews have always been noticeably different in the countries wherein they have been scattered, and this is one of the reasons whereby they are singled out for prejudice and persecution. But God has a way of turning the tables. As we said, the reason why the Jewish people continue is because of their connection, and God has chosen them as a people to himself, and that's the people whereby God is planning to deliver his purpose and blessings to the whole world. And so, much to Haman's humiliation, King Artaxerxes commanded that Mordecai was honoured for thwarting an earlier assassination attempt against the king. And the king commanded that Haman do the honours, and Haman had the task of walking Mordecai through the city on horseback and proclaiming the king's admiration for him. And Queen Esther, who was also a Jew, used her position to intercede for her people, and we can see her here approaching the throne room. And Esther confronted the king regarding Haman's plot against her people, and the king was furious and left the room. And eventually, after Haman threw himself at Queen Esther in order to plead for his life, the king, re-entering the room, flew into a rage and committed Haman to death, and Haman was hanged on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai, and the plan or the plot to commit genocide against the Jews throughout the Persian Empire was thwarted and reversed, and the Jews were given that commandment that they were allowed to act in self-defence. So we see then that without the providence and care of God in this incident, the Jewish people would have suffered greatly at the hands of Haman. Instead, the situation was reversed. But history testifies that God has not always used providence to look after his people while they have been scattered abroad. And we can see, as our title for our talk has it, that persecution against the Jews has taken place throughout the ages. This subject has been considered many times before, and we've gone through and documented some of the persecutions and sufferings that the Jews have faced wherever they have been scattered abroad. So I've picked out a few notable examples. Perhaps one of the first examples of anti-Semitism outside of the scriptures can be traced perhaps to the 3rd century BC to Alexandria, And Alexandria in Egypt was home to the largest Jewish diaspora community in the world at the time. It's where the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was produced. And Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest and historian of that era, wrote scathingly of the Jews, and his writings are preserved to this day. And his themes and prejudice against the Jews are repeated by many of the works of historians at the time, including people like Tacitus, who we might have heard of, a Roman historian. One of the earliest anti-Jewish edicts, promulgated by Antiochus IV Epiphanes in about 170 to 167 BC, sparked a revolt of the Maccabees in Judea. And as we move forward through the ages, there are many examples of anti-Semitism that has been committed against the Jews. Not just isolated incidents, but laws and commandments which force the Jews into not being allowed to practice some of their religious customs. There are examples of Greek rulers desecrating the temple and banning Jewish religious practices such as circumcision, the Sabbath day, a study of Jewish religious books, for example. As well, there's record of the Jewish diaspora on the island in the River Nile, Elephantine, which was founded by mercenaries, experienced the destruction of its temple in 410 BC. In the Roman Empire, relationships between the Jewish people were at times antagonistic and resulted in several rebellions. According to Suetonius, the Emperor Tiberius, seen here, a bust depicting him, expelled from Rome Jews who had gone to live there. And while the 18th century English historian Edward Gibbon does speak about a more tolerant period in Roman-Jewish relations beginning in about 160 AD, when Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, the state's attitude toward the Jews gradually worsened. And James Carroll, a historian, wrote and reminds us all that Jews accounted for about 10% of the total population of the Roman Empire. So by that ratio, if other factors such as pogroms and conversions had not intervened, there would be about 200 million Jews in the world today instead of something like 13 million. So that short paragraph there from the historian James Carroll really drives the point home about the persecution of the Jews, saying that there should be about 200 million in the world today. In the Middle Ages, in the late 6th century, the newly Catholicized Visigothic kingdom in Spain issued a series of anti-Jewish edicts which forbade Jews from marrying Christians, practicing circumcision and observing Jewish holy days. And during the Middle Ages in Europe, there was persecution against Jews in many places, with blood libels, expulsions, forced conversions and massacres. A main justification of prejudice against Jews in Europe was, of course, religious, seen as the killers of Christ. The persecution hit its peak during the Crusades. In the First Crusade in 1096, depicted here on the left on the screen, hundreds or even thousands of Jews were killed as the Crusaders arrived. This was the first major outbreak of anti-Jewish violence in Europe outside of Spain, and was cited actually by Zionists in the 19th century as one of the reasons for the need of a state of Israel. On the right here, the picture's been chopped up a little bit, but that's a depiction of Jews wearing the mandatory Jewish badge and Jewish hat, being burned during the Black Death in 1348. And as the Black Death epidemic devastated Europe, causing the death of a large part of the population, Jews were used as scapegoats. And rumours spread that they had caused the disease by deliberately poisoning wells. And hundreds of Jewish communities were destroyed in numerous persecutions. One example, in 1348, 900 Jews were burned alive in Strasbourg, where the plague had not yet affected the city. Even in Mexico City, there was anti-Semitism. In 1601, the execution of Mariana de Carabajal was accused of a relapse into Judaism and was executed. During the mid to late 17th century, in what's now known today as Poland and Lithuania. They were devastated by several conflicts in which the Commonwealth lost over a third of its population, over 3 million people, and Jewish losses were counted in the hundreds of thousands. And the first of these conflicts was the Khmelnytsky uprising, when supporters of Bohdan Khmelnytsky massacred tens of thousands of Jews in the eastern and southern areas he controlled in today's Ukraine. The precise number of dead may never be known, but the decrease of the Jewish population during that period is estimated at 100,000 to 200,000. And European immigrants to the United States brought anti-Semitism to the country of America, as early as the 17th century. The Dutch governor of New Amsterdam implemented plans to prevent Jews from settling in the city. And during the colonial era, the American government limited the political and economic rights of Jews. In 1744, moving on a little bit, Frederick II of Prussia, seen here on the right-hand side, limited the number of Jews allowed to live in Breslau to only 10 so-called protected Jewish families, and encouraged a similar practice in other Prussian cities. In the same year, Archduchess of Austria, Maria Theresa, seen on the left, ordered Jews out of Bohemia, but soon reversed her position on the condition that Jews pay for their readmission every 10 years. This extortion was known as Malkageld, the Queen's money. And in 1752, she introduced the law limiting each Jewish family to one son. So these were just some of the events which I picked out on my studies of anti-Semitism throughout the ages, and particularly it seems to have been centred and particularly bad in Europe, and particularly at the time of what we know as medieval Europe, perhaps when the Catholic Church held the most sway in Europe and when they were able to promote their idea of the Jews as being Christ killers. Of course, we can't really talk about abuse of the Jews and their persecution throughout the ages without referencing the Holocaust. And this is an anti-Semitic newspaper called Der Stürmer, and it was presented in Nazi Germany and mounted here on these boards. You can see here at the top you've got the name Judah, and there was actually promoted a public reading of this newspaper. I'm sure we all know the history of the Holocaust, how in Germany Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in 1933 and instituted many laws which denied the Jews basic civil rights. The Nuremberg laws, perhaps, are the most famous of these, which in September 1935 prohibited sexual relations and marriages between Aryans and Jews as race disgrace, and stripped all German Jews, even quarter and half Jews, of their citizenship, and their official title became subjects of the state. And on the night of the 9th of November 1938, the German state instituted a pogrom, dubbed Kristallnacht, in which Jews were killed, their property destroyed, and their synagogues torched. And anti-Semitic laws were extended to German-occupied Europe in the wake of the conquest of the Nazi Germany, often building on local anti-Semitic traditions. In the east, the Third Reich forced Jews into ghettos in Warsaw, in Krakow, in Lviv, in Lublin, and in Radom. And after the beginning of the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1941, a campaign of mass murder conducted by the Einsatzgruppen culminated from 1942 to 1945 in systematic genocide, the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were known to have been killed. But despite all this, as Mark Twain wrote, the Jew has remained, despite all this persecution. And in recent times they have not only remained but flourished. Why is this? See here a picture of some of the return to the Jews as they emigrated in Europe back to the state of Israel as it had been established. And we might be familiar with some of the pictures here of some of the events which led up to the creation of the state of Israel. But the answer again is found in the scriptures as to why the Jews have remained. We have here in Jeremiah chapter 46, verse 27, "Fear not, O Jacob my servant, nor be dismayed, O Israel, for behold, I will save you from far away, and your offspring from the land of their captivity. Jacob shall return and have quiet and ease, and none shall make him afraid. Fear not, O Jacob my servant, declares the Lord, for I am with you. I will make a full end of all the nations to which I have driven you, but of you I will not make a full end. I will discipline you in just measure, but I will by no means leave you unpunished." So this is the words of the prophet Jeremiah. We note there that while God might make a full end of all nations, he would not make a full end of the Jews. In Amos in chapter 9, verse 7, "Are you not like the Cushites to me, O people of Israel, declares the Lord? Did I not bring up Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Kir? Behold, the eyes of the Lord are upon the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from the surface of the ground, except that I will not utterly destroy the house of Jacob, declares the Lord. For behold, I will command and shake the house of Israel among all the nations as one shakes with a sieve, but no pebble shall fall to the earth." In Jeremiah 32, "For thus says the Lord, just as I have brought all this great disaster upon this people, so I will bring upon them all the good that I have promised them. Fields shall be brought in this land of which you are saying, it is a desolation, without man and beast, it is given into the hands of the Chaldeans. Fields shall be bought for money, and deeds shall be signed and sealed and witnessed in the land of Benjamin, in the places about Jerusalem, and in the cities of Judah, in the cities of the hill country, in the cities of the Shephelah, and in the cities of the Negev. For I will restore their fortunes, declares the Lord." So this really is the reason why the Jews have continued. It's because they are remaining the people of God, and God has not cast them away, as we read in Romans in chapter 11. And again, with all this history of persecution and prejudice against the Jewish people and the decimation of their population, we might also say, has God cast away his people, as Paul coined that term in Romans in chapter 11. But it's the same answer. God forbid. For I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, and so all Israel shall be saved. As it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant unto them, when I shall take away their sins. As concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sakes, but as touching the election, they are beloved for the Father's sakes." So the scriptures are clear all the time that the Jews reject the teaching of God and the gospel as it's found in the scriptures. They will live under this era of persecution and affliction and prejudice. But the Bible clearly foretells a day in which those blessings spoken about in the covenant made with Moses will, of a fullness, come to part. And Paul talks about this here in Romans 11, when ungodliness shall be turned away from Jacob. And the scriptures describe how this is the work of the Lord Jesus Christ when he is to return to the earth. So returning back to Leviticus in chapter 26, we read there the summarised answer to this question of will the persecution of the Jews continue. We read there in Leviticus chapter 26, "If they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in their treachery that they committed against me, and also in walking contrary to me, so that I walked contrary to them, God says, and brought them into the land of their enemies, if then their uncircumcised heart is humbled, and they make amends for their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. Yet for all that, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not spurn them, neither will I abhor them so as to destroy them utterly and break my covenant with them. For I am the Lord their God. But I will, for their sake, remember the covenant with their forefather, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt, in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am the Lord." So this promise that God made to the nation of Israel at the time of Moses has stood the test of time. And despite all these persecutions and suffering that the Jews have gone through the centuries, they still exist as the people of God, as the people of the book. And this surely, the example and history of the nation of Israel, is perhaps the greatest witness to the truth of God's word today. So that's something we can all trust in. Thank you.